Thank you, Jessica. So please don't bypass what you just heard. What you see here today is what we kind of consider adult programming on a Saturday afternoon here at the library, and obviously there's a lot of interested parties in these types of subjects. So if you have ideas of subjects, content, criteria, what have you, please share it with the library, and maybe we can get a presentation just like this for something you're thinking about. So my name is Matt Wint. I've lived in the community here, Front Royal, for about 20 years. Really appreciative of the library for hosting us today to hear this fantastic presentation that you're all about to hear. Just want to plug two organizations that I'm involved with here in our community. The first one is the Isaac Walton League of Warren County. If you haven't heard of them, they have a tremendous property here near Browntown. They accept members. There is a campground, an archery range, a shooting range, and you know what? Their whole mission is about teaching the next generation about conservation of nature and water animals. So if that's something you believe in and something you can get behind, use your Google skills and look up the Isaac Walton League of Warren County and look for membership there. Second organization is the Archaeological Society of Virginia, and that's why we are all here today. So this is a group that has chapters throughout the state. There is one in Stephen City that you can get involved with, and I think there's one in the Springfield area, Northern Virginia area, that you can get involved with as well. Like I said, I'm a member and in their program. This is a fantastic way to network with those who are also interested in archaeology. You know, we live in a fantastic state for archaeology, being here in Virginia, so you can imagine there's a lot of projects that have not yet been unearthed or solved. So if this is something you'd consider, the Archaeological Society, or ASV as it's called, it would interest you. So now let's kind of get to the good stuff, right? So we're all here today because of archaeology. Obviously we all kind of have an interest in it in some way, and maybe some of the people in this room remember way back in the late 70s when a group of college students came to our area and did several test pits down in the 340 South corridor. It was called Thunderbird. The Washington Post issued an article about it. If you can use those Google skills, you can even find it yet today. Well, it turns out a lot of those college students kind of grew up and came back to solve something that was not yet resolved. And so we found, others have found a new site. The name of it is Jasper Ridge. We have two speakers for you here today. The first one is Mike Johnson. Mike is a lithic technology subject matter expert, senior archaeologist, retired from Fairfax County for some 32 years. He's more busy now than he's ever been, and he leads the project nearby, the one that we're going to be talking about today, Jasper Ridge, which is part of that Thunderbird complex. The second person is Bob Richardson. Bob is also a lithic technologist. He's a medical doctor. He's a landowner in the area, and he's going to speak to us a little bit, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy that just as well. So we're here for just about an hour and a half more or so. We did write in the newspaper and other places. If you had any artifacts, please bring them with you today. I can assure you that the project you're going to hear about next is done with the utmost integrity. The folks that I have seen work on this project do it as absolutely correct as could be, and really are doing it to collect data. So that's what we're seeking, and maybe people in this room have something to share with us after the presentation. So please save your questions to the end. I think I have said enough at this point. I'd like to hand it over to our speaker, Mike Johnson. Please, Mike, go ahead.
Thanks, man. Okay, might as well get started. Everybody can hear? Might have to move up if you're all the way back there. Anyway, we need light down probably for the people in the back. I was back there, and this is kind of like hard to see. There's going to be some fine detail in this, so a little darker would be good. Is that better? Yes. Okay. Let's see if I can get the pointer right. Okay, got the pointer and everything. Well, I didn't really need it on this one. That's the Jasper Ridge site, and it is the Thunderbird complex. I'll get into that. but Jasper Ridge is the highest point in that complex. Sits up where the Catholic University people probably would never have looked because they didn't. This is the 560th site found in Warren County, and Thunderbird was the 11th. And then it got up to 50 with the 50 site, because they were looking in the floodplain. So, let's see, am I going the right way? Yep. Okay, here we are, looking at site within the overall context of the landforms in this region. And as you can see, it's pretty dynamic, at least it was, and it still is in terms of erosion. But that got there somehow, that built up. And I'd like to start at the beginning of this. Anyway, well, this isn't really the beginning because there's other stuff before. But the mountains here were, of course, pushed up when Pangaea was being formed way back. And this is sort of what it would look like if you were back 240 million years ago. There's no Atlantic Ocean between Morocco, Western Sahara, and Virginia back then. I like to say that if you were in the Culpeper Basin, which is on the other side of the mountain, well, if you're in Washington, D.C., the Culpeper Basin, and we'll get to that. Let me go there. Let's see if we can get here. Come on. Okay. That's what you saw back then. But the Atlantic Ocean was formed, and this is a diagram of the way it got formed. And if you were in Washington, D.C., and the Culpeper Basin had been the rift that had succeeded rather than failed, Washington, D.C. would be in Africa now. Now that probably wouldn't bother anybody from here, but you know, it would be there. And this is what it was like when it started to break up, the Pangaean supercontinent. And this is about 100 million years ago, and this is 13,000 years ago. Here's North America, and here's Africa, and you can follow how we got here. On top of all that, of course, you have climate, and you have things that erode those mountains. Because those mountains that were pushed up back then, 300, 400 million years ago, are thought to be anywhere between the elevation of the Rockies or even the Himalayas. And subsequently, they have eroded down because there's nothing pushing them up anymore. So that's just a little lightness, but climate change happens. Now, this is the Wisconsin glaciation was the last glacier that was here. Anywhere from maybe 30,000 up to, started to recede probably around 16, 17,000 years ago. And so we were pretty close. I think, under 1,000 miles to a glacier that was 5,000 feet thick, sitting on top of Boston and New York and Chicago and Cleveland. That's how much ice was up there. And that really plays a huge part in this because, of course, the heavy air cold on top comes down the front of the glacier, hits the ground, and heads south. And that has a great effect here. The U.S. Geological Survey team I was working with, when I was working over on the other side of the mountain, the head there said that he thought that the winds, based on what he'd seen in the dune formations along the Chesapeake, would have been 30 to 40 miles an hour average. Okay, of course, with the rapidly changing climate as the glacier moves north and melts back, you see a change in the vegetation out in front. And of course, the big star is where we are. And if you're back then, we were on the border, well, we're into what's called the boreal forest, which mainly been spruce pine. But there would have been tundra in northern Pennsylvania, through Pennsylvania, and in New England back then. So, but then as it changed over a fairly rapid period of time, most of that change took place after about 15,000 years ago. The boreal forest is up here, and we are now, at that time, on the boundary of the boreal forest and a broadleaf deciduous forest. Interestingly though, and I'll say this numerous times, there's no modern analog for those times in terms of the climate and the environment. We don't have anything now like that. And that may affect what we do, what we see here. The major types of animals that may have been here, I put the question mark on the mammoth. No real evidence of that, of mammoth here at the time we're talking about for Clovis, which is 13,000 years ago. Caribou, though, is a different story. There's a place called Caribou, Maine, and it isn't based on the barren ground caribou with hundreds of and thousands of caribou running around, you know, round trip 800 miles during the year. They're a subgroup of caribou that migrated vertically during historic times. I'm not sure, actually, the experts on caribou are not sure that even the caribou back then looked like the caribou today. They may have been somewhere in between. Because caribou, and I'll get into them later, are an important aspect of this. Mastodon probably were, and as of course were deer, because mastodon's a browser. It eats bushes, you might say, whereas a mammoth is a grazer. It eats grass. And so the mammoth would have a tendency to be near where grass is, whereas mastodon in the forest. And they were smaller herds, larger herds, and bigger. This 9 feet at the shoulders, that can be 12 or more, depending on the subgroup of mastodon. Okay, Flint Run regional context. There are a number, this is one of the richer areas of early sites in the United States. I don't know of an area that has more in the same amount of area of these early sites, particularly the yellow ones. These are older than Clovis. And I excavated here, and this, spent a lot of time on this one. We have a cast of the point from this site, which is off in the ocean. It was brought up with scallop dredge. This was excavated, these sites were excavated by a fellow named Darren Lowry many years ago. And we are currently working at Smith Mountain Gap, where we have a very heavy, older than Clovis component, more so than the Clovis component, at least as far as the diagnostic artifacts are concerned. So it looks like people are pretty sure we're here at least 20,000 years ago in this region, maybe even older. Oh, here are the points, 17,000 plus or minus. This is the main point style from Cactus Hill in the Nottoway, which, by the way, the excavation of Cactus Hill blew open the whole peopling of the Americas question or continent. I didn't find this. This is a fellow named Joe McAvoy. We had 2 teams working on the site, and he hit these below Clovis. And he got carbon date of 15,070 plus or minus 70, which calibrates to about 18,000 years ago. And so as a result, archaeologists started digging deeper than they had in the past, because this dominated the Clovis first model ever since the 1930s. So anyway, and these are some of the, in Thunderbird, and the 50 site are here in the Front Royal area, south of here. Okay, the Flint Run Paleo-Indian Project. Northern Shenandoah Chapter, Archaeological Society of Virginia. The members were finding artifacts in Jasper in this area, and they got in touch with Bill Gardner, who was supposed to give a talk, and he sent a student up to give it. And the student came back and said, "You got to come up and see this." And he did. They did the geology. The Thunderbird site itself is a good 4 feet below the surface. So it's not something you're going to find walking around. And there's a Smithsonian, National Geographic did an article, and they showed a picture of one of the places they excavated there, how undisturbed it is. They have the imprint or the shadow of where the person who was making the stone tool sat, how his legs, his or her legs were on the ground with the artifacts scattered around that shadow. In other words, a blank spot in the artifacts. Because they did the right thing, of course, there. That was a really cutting edge excavation. They mapped everything. They had a dentist come down, and he went around and he exposed all the artifacts on the surface so that they could take good photographs. And then they took three-dimensional coordinates on everything. All that material's in the Smithsonian right now. And Dr. Bill Gardner was the head of that at Catholic University, 1971 to 83. Push the right button. Okay, remember I was talking about the Pangea and pushing up the mountains and everything? Well, the Blue Ridge, in pushing this direction, when the continents, African plate and the North American plate were running together, it was pushing that rock together. And there's a thrust fault where the granite is being pushed over the older limestone that forms the base for the valley. And that's why you've got sinkholes. And the sinkholes are in the limestone, not in the granite. And so you're all aware, of course, those. Well, Thunderbird, sitting here, is a southeast exposure because this is highland. This is Massanutten Mountain way back here. And so it goes up this way and up this way from the floodplain. Thunderbird is protected in the back by high elevation, and Gardner came to the conclusion because of that it was a winter site. Because think of the Pleistocene with the winds coming down from here. You do want to be in the wintertime hunkered down somewhere. And so that was his assumption. And Jasper Ridge, though, which we will get into, is the exact opposite. It's sitting on top of a ridge, hence the name. So we'll get into that, because that's a really important part of this. See, and of course the Jasper outcrop is along that fault, fortunately for us, and that's why the prehistoric people, one of the reasons why they were here, was to get that stone. Okay, here in 2017, the Thunderbird Corporation, which is Gardner's old contract firm, got a contract to check out the Flint Run Quarry, 44WR4, which was on private land, and it was being thought that the owner wanted to donate it, because he couldn't do anything with it. Wanted to donate it to the Archaeological Conservancy, so the Conservancy hired Thunderbird to come out and do a test. And Yvonne's back here somewhere, and there may be some of the other crew from that dig. I was there, and we put in 2 squares on the site. Test pit 1, test pit 2. They were 1 meter squares, 3 foot approximately, and this is we excavated the topsoil, and then we did a corner, because we only had 1 day. That's contract archaeology for you. It depends on the money, how much money you have for the paid staff. We were volunteers, but that's the only reason this was going to get done like this. Well, test pit 1 produced more than 15,000 artifacts in that little surface area right there. Test pit 2, which was exactly like this, I think this is test pit 2, isn't it, Yvonne? Maybe, okay. But 286 artifacts, and they're only 20 feet apart. Now, of course, it doesn't take much to think, wow, that means we're on the boundary. The boundary is right between the 2 of them. And it's likely that the quarry is undisturbed. And so that's a pristine site. However, those of you who work for Warren County, they said it wasn't worth anything for a tax write-off. So he didn't donate it to the Archaeological Conservancy, but he's a steward of it. He's very careful and watches it and takes care of it. We know him. He's one of our neighbors and friends. So anyway, but as you can see from the topographic mapping here that Kurt got off of the LiDAR, one of our crew, Jasper Ridge is pretty high. Now think about that other thing we were talking about of exposure. Would you want to be there in the wintertime during the Ice Age, sitting up on top of a hill? Don't think so. But in the summertime you might, and we'll get into that. That's a good reason for being up there. Okay, one of the things that benefits you from this site is the view sheds. You can see all the way up Page Valley to the southwest. You can see the Blue Ridge, the top of the Blue Ridge here, and all the smaller hills in between. And you can probably see Massanutten. We couldn't get a good picture because of the trees. But back then, probably not trees, and we'll get into that. And the same thing to the north, which is exposed, as you can see, because the wind will come right down this valley from the glacier. And then this is a southeast view. So there's a lot of visibility. And this goes back to that. This is the Barren, I've already talked about this, so I won't spend any time on it. Barren ground caribou and the woodland caribou, you can see they're big by comparison to these guys. These guys are nowhere near the size of these. They can be, I don't know how many pounds heavier. But understanding caribou patterns are key to understanding Ice Age human settlement patterns. Okay, this is a cross-section, idealized cross-section based on Victor Carbone, who was one of Gardner's students who did his dissertation on the environmental reconstruction of this area. And as you'll notice, tundra, this is at 13,000 years ago when the site was occupied by the Paleo, like Clovis. Not earlier would have been probably even more so. But you have tundra on the upland, no trees. You have tundra or grassland on the upland elevations that are more exposed. Here is Jasper Ridge, which is on top, which would be grass. Here's Thunderbird down in this valley. And then you come over here, you got grassland on the highland, and then you got a lot of tundra on top of the mountain up there. Which means people living here can see caribou or whatever animals, herd animals, are up there in the summertime. The reason those animals are up there in the summertime, based on, I did a paper for Bill Gardner back in 1980 on caribou as a human resource, and discovered by reading stuff on caribou, that caribou in the summertime in Alaska, in the North Country, seek, of course, tundra, exposed areas, but they also seek the highest points of land they can find with lots of wind, and if they've got it, residual snow or ice. Anybody think of why? Bugs. If you've ever been to the north, you know. Black flies, mosquitoes, in this case they've got warble flies and all the kinds of insects that are bloodsuckers. 90% of the living organisms up there suck. Literally. Anyway, so this is what it would have looked like ideally, based on what we know. And we don't, there is no modern analog for this, but this is an estimate. And if you had tundra up here, you probably had caribou, because you had all this exposure up top for them to calve and to be in the summertime. That closed up though by 11,005, it started to close up probably around 11,500 years ago. Okay, and one of the other ways, you do a little research outside to see what's going on, and this is Alaska. And these are where the sites in by 1998, the sites that they had recorded, and we had what their landform and aspects were. 31 out of 39 of them were on ridges, bluffs, knolls or plateaus or promontories that they found. That doesn't mean there aren't more sites down here, but you just can't find them. Because either they've been washed away or they're buried, so they're harder to find. So this is another indication of why Jasper Ridge was probably a summer occupation. Now, that's just providing more of context for it, so you get involved with what the site's like and what they were looking at around them if they were up there. Now, our excavation involves three essential parts. One is and there's four, but there's a second one here. There are two parts of this. We have completed the 1 in 400 sample, which means we've excavated the site at a 20-foot interval with 1-foot squares all the way across it, 280 some, and I'll show you that in just a minute. And the second part is the experimental workshops, where we are going to look, we've already started, but we're going to continue to look at the technology in using the stone, particularly, to see if we can figure out what's going on with them. And the third is getting rid of the perk tests, because the previous owner had put 14, 15 perk tests all over the site and didn't backfill. Well, we'll get to that too. Okay, here's the grid. Each one of those is a 1-foot square dug to the bottom of the plow zone. Because this site is deflated, being up high, it's been plowed forever, and it's been deflated by just erosion. I'll tell you, Agnes, if this had been plowed when Agnes came through, Agnes probably leveled a lot of this, took most of the soil off. So that's the grid that we use on the upland. Now, oh, don't forget, the reason we haven't gone over here yet, and we're planning to, is that there are bulldozer piles all over the place over here. Someone came in and really pushed this around. Over here, we have a drop-off on both sides into this is a spring head, and this is a spring-fed stream. Here, the owner has cut off the end of Jasper Ridge, cut and filled, cut it back in and had built their house there. They didn't know what it was. I mean, it was just building a house. They weren't doing anything wrong, but they built their house there. So that's not an area to go. We're not gonna find anything. We're down 20 feet, 10 feet from where the old surface was. And up here, we have another property boundary, and we know from the excavation we did here that this site keeps going in that direction toward the north and the top of the hill, top of the ridge. Here's a distribution map on the Jasper that we got from the 20-foot interval. Big concentration here, and that's even split into two concentrations. There's another one here, a smaller one here, the little ones. So there are concentrations of the material. It's not evenly across the site. By the way, this site is vegetated still. It's got trees on it and all. So not much exposed. This is probably 18,000, I think it's 18,000 artifacts. Came just from that 1/400 sample. But the diagnostics, points, big tools and big stuff like that aren't there. There are very few of them left because when this was plowed, almost positively it was collected heavily. Because when Thunderbird was being excavated, everybody up here knew that there were paleo sites around, and they would have found the paleo material up here, and they would have collected. And so what we get is micro fragments anymore. But that's, hey, from our standpoint, it's information we're after. For example, archaeologists don't only look at the artifacts, they also look at the space between them. We value the space between the artifacts as much as we do them themselves. Because that gives the artifacts meaning in terms of the people who dropped them. Now, we know that I'm confident that the 10-foot interval is going to be really good. That's a 1 in 100 sample. We're going to do, so that's 1% of the site. Here we have the quartzite artifacts, different raw material, not jasper. And this is the this big concentration right here on the north 300, east 300 transect. That shovel test. And those right around it is right here. That's where the quartzite concentrates. Here's the greenstone. There's no greenstone on the location where the quartzite is. Well, that's weird. That means that there's some integrity to this site. It isn't all mixed up. And so we hope with the 10-foot interval to be able to isolate stuff within these concentrations. Activity areas, places where actual structures may have been and people actually did work. Our problem, and I'll get to it a little bit, is the chronology. Because it's all mixed up, we've got the 4,000-year-old stuff mixed in with the 13,000-year-old stuff. So anyway, but that's the objective, is to eventually get to it, as well as we want to test really off to the west and test down through maybe the that erosional gully area down below it to see if there's something deeply buried, or if there might have been a ledge here that got covered with soil that might have something underneath it that we missed. Okay, now this is one of the reasons why we're going to the 10. Back when I was with Fairfax County, one of the projects I did was on a stormwater management pond that was impacting a site that had produced what's called Marcy Creek pottery from around 3,000 years ago. And it's soapstone tempered, and the Marcy Creek pottery is thought to have been along the Potomac River, and this is 11 miles from the Potomac River. So I thought this had to be pretty significant. So we did a 20-foot interval, and we got concentrations of fire-cracked rock right here. Fire-cracked rock would come with hearths, either where you're cooking or keeping warm in the winter, where you bring the rocks in that serve as a radiator. So the next year after we did this test, and I didn't feel comfortable because we got nothing out of this. really. I thought, well, we don't have anything else to do, and I had a Dutch archaeologist who came in and wanted to volunteer, so we decided to do an audit of what we did the year before, and went back in and infilled at 10. And these are all the firecrack rock features that we got from the shovel testing. They're in a big arc along this drainage and then along the edge of the floodplain. We got the quartz artifacts and bifaces concentrating in here, and the unifaces, which is like scrapers, between these firecrack rock and the edge of the floodplain. This is the drier area, and this is where but also, look at all the diagnostic artifacts, all the way back to 11,000 years ago that came out of there. And we hit one single pot break, where one pot had broken there. And this pottery also, this is called Pope's Creek. This is not usually found in the interior either. And yet we found it there with all of that. The key was, one of the keys to it all, why we found this undisturbed, there were chestnut sprouts. Chestnut trees coming off the rootstock. The chestnut sprouts were coming off, and chestnuts had been, the chestnut went under here, got wiped out by the blight by 1920. And those chestnut trees were probably 100 years old when they got blighted. So this thing hadn't been plowed below here, below right through here. Hadn't been plowed in probably 200 years. And that's why we got that. Okay, now we get into the sort of the nitty-gritty on what we've been finding. The first question we were asking is, you know, all the data at the beginning and the context that we saw was leading us to believe that it had to be a summer base camp. The interesting thing, I may have mentioned Cactus Hill early, the site that's the pre-Clovis site down in southeast Virginia on the Nottoway River. It is on the south side of the Nottoway River. Now, that shouldn't be there if we're talking about Pleistocene and everybody living on the north side of the river to stay protected from the wind and ice and slow and cold. But this is sitting out in the open in the floodplain. And so that, all of a sudden, light bulbs go on and say, well, there has to be a reason for that. And that is summer. And that's where the link to the caribou come in. And their summer being up on the tundra where they got a lot of wind and where they can get up, because they're not gonna be in the forest. I mean, that's just blood-sucking country. Anyway, so what we've got here is a whole variety of complex tools. This is an end scraper, and it's most likely, the odds are probably 80% that that's close age, that tool, because of the way it's flaked. The center ridge, it's flaked all the way to the center ridge. Later, they made end scrapers also. But usually they weren't flaked like this to the center ridge. And the end scraper, this is the bit. Now an end scraper is used, hafted, and probably an antler handle, used to scrape hide, particularly the inside. Then we got, these are a couple of other scrapers. These are probably early archaic. They're probably later in the time period. 11,000, I'll show in the next slide the dating stuff. This is a complex tool, but it's made of rhyolite, which comes from South Mountain in Maryland. And we did not get a lot of exotic stone, which is very important here, because the Clovis period is thought to have involved people who moved all over the place. And so you should get exotic stone, like Smith Mountain Gap is the best collection of exotic stone I've ever seen on any site anywhere. And so it looks like a rendezvous there where people are coming from even Kentucky and Tennessee and North Carolina to that location and meeting. Here at the Thunderbird site, Gardner wasn't finding anything that wasn't Jasper. One or two pieces, but they could be local. They were chalcedony, and there's chalcedony in this area. So the thought, what his idea was that these were a fairly local settlement pattern. But he had a winter side of it, and we were saying, well, what do we have? We have a base camp that looks like a summer, which, you know, one could, you know, if one wanted to, they could say, well, that contradicts Gardner. But no, it actually, and we'll go into it, it actually helps to demonstrate what Gardner was talking about. Anyway, we've got a multi-purpose tool here with a heat altered awl or spur. There's a side scraper here on that side. This has a side scraper here, a spoke shave like here, a spur here, and an end scraper bit along the end. Multi-purpose tool, probably early archaic. We have no real evidence from the Thunderbird site that there was any rhyolite in the Clovis, but there was rhyolite in early archaic. And when we get to the points, we'll see. A piece of the limonite, which is in the bedrock, that looks like an abrader. You've got spurs, heat-tipped spurs. Could have been used for a whole variety of things. We don't know yet. You probably do the analysis on it and get some idea what they were used for. And a couple of side scrapers. They're flaked in one direction. These are called unifaces. And the flake scars are going in that way. This is the inside of the flake that was flaked off. And then this is the top side or dorsal side of it. Same thing with this. This is the dorsal side of the scraper, and this is the ventral side that was on the flake or blade that was struck off in order to make it. And we'll go a little bit into that technology later on. So, and we get it, but speaking of blades, we've got prismatic blades, and quite a few of them. So that was not found with Thunderbird. Now, I've been looking at the Thunderbird material at the Smithsonian, and they're there. We'll get into why that probably happened. Okay, is a Clovis age component present? Well, we've got a preform that has been fluted up both sides, both faces. Here, this is one face. This is the channel flake going up that direction, flake scar. And here it is on the other side where it ended right there and ended right there. And this is where it would be located on this other preform, which is definitely later in stage than this one. Fluted points were fluted in the early stages, early and often. It was not as big a deal as a lot of people think, or we were been led to think. The end scraper we have blades, large prismatic blades, which are thought to be almost exclusively in the Clovis period. And a couple of what we believe are channel flakes. Well, the importance of channel flakes are they're only done on Clovis. That's as good as having the point. That's the flake that comes off the middle, this flake. We don't have anybody else doing that in this region. So if you got a channel flake, this is the striking area for the channel flake going up. But having it in quartz, if this is, I'm not 100% certain yet, but if it is one, it's hugely significant. Because why would someone bring quartz to a Jasper core? Yellowstone you need. So there has to be something why this beautiful piece of really high quality quartz is sitting on there, and it might, if it's a flute, it's a channel flake from a flute, then we're starting to get into why those kinds of questions that we couldn't answer if we didn't have this. Now the other time periods, we have early archaic, we have, burned up part of a 11,000-year-old point, 10,500, 10,000-year-old, used up, broken up pieces. But we know that tells us the time period we're dealing with. They can give us who was there. We have one little piece of a bifurcate, the stem of a bifurcate point from the upper part of the site, not in the main concentration. But we also have Savannah River in there, which is 4,500, 3,700 years ago. And my thinking is with this, it's probably why the quartzite and greenstone are up there. Because we don't find on the sites elsewhere jasper that are, at least as far as I know, you don't find much jasper associated with this, or cryptocrystal. It's a different technique from flint knapping this than for flint knapping this. These people were flexible, the Clovis people. They could knap just about anything because they knew how to adapt to the stone. These people appear to have been mostly locked in on a certain kind of stone, and it's common. Quartzite, and up here greenstone, they're common, that material, and they seem to be really locked in on it. And I'm thinking the reason they may have been up on this site, it would have been forested most likely, and they were probably exploiting the nut harvest. as well as maybe hunting in the neighborhood. But oak, hickory, chestnut forest may have been up there, and that's probably why they were there. Okay, now, so Gardner's model was this one, and he didn't have this because he focused on the stratified sites, the buried sites, and even up until the 1990s, when he was running his contract firm, he traditionally blew off all the upland sites as disturbed and not having valuable information, potentially National Register valuable information. It wasn't until we down in Fairfax County found upland sites with pit features that the erosion didn't get to, that all of a sudden, oh, they're there. 4,000-year-old pit feature. But, so that's probably why he missed this. But then again, he came out of a period in time, you know, the 60s, when this was the thing to do. You went for the deep sites to where you had integrity. Well, we just times change. And we got this. Bob invited me up to play with this. And so we worked on it. And this is the summer base camp for that model. Essentially what Gardner found here appears to be here because we're not getting exotic stone. These people don't appear to have been spending much time going over the mountains into the coastal plain or all other different kinds of areas. They appear to be pretty happy here. And that's unusual in Clovis sites, Clovis age sites. They would move, they would be here in the winter, and they just cross and go up the creek to here in the summertime, stay out of the bugs. When we were excavating back here, it was hot and buggy. It was awful to work down in here during the summertime. And that probably was, the bugs were probably even worse back then. So anyway, that's I think we're pretty solid on the base camp model. At least that's where we are right now. But these are only two sites. One is an accident, two is a coincidence, and three is a pattern. So more sites need to be found and tested here to get an idea of the full pattern. There may be other base camps. This is only one hill. Okay, the experimental work, the workshops, it involved measuring, mapping, and doing all the paperwork on it, setting up the fires, and then to produce these spalls. These are the basic element you use in making a fluted point. And what happens is, by doing the firing, it's very difficult to get a good spall off of a big glob of stone because you don't have any place to really work it. And this is a much quicker way of getting them. Plus, it also heat treats the stone, makes it easier to nap. But Bob's going to get into that more at the end because he's running it. Okay, the other is the perk test, spoil pile screening, reduce spot contamination. When they took the soil out of the hole and dumped it over here, what they did, they took the artifacts with it and dumped it over here. 50 years from now, another Agnes or two, and these spoil piles are going to be flat. And that means the artifacts over here are going to be a peak. Remember when I was showing the shovel test and how you had these peaks of artifacts? We're all of a sudden going to have, oh, they were living here. We have twice as many artifacts as we have anywhere else around that spot. So we decided, no, we're going to get these. We're going to screen them back in rather than shoveling them back in because that's going to put half of the artifacts down 2-3 feet. We're going to go ahead and screen them because a side of that is we're going to get a high quality study collection of blades, points, tools, debitage that will give us a lot of the stuff we're studying here that's coming out of this are coming out of the perk test, particularly the blades and some of the other things in the flake analysis. It's, I think, Bob is going to be able to revolutionize the way we think of flint work and the way they made their stone tools. What was I going to go with that? I had a brain cramp. High quality study collection. Yeah. Oh, we're already out of these at probably 35,000 artifacts that we've cataloged And we're probably gonna be, before this is all done, with the 10-foot interval too, probably pushing 80, 100,000 artifacts. Now, the trick is, we're not getting a lot of the diagnostics, but we will have a study collection to look at the technologies. Oops, let's hold that. Okay, one of the things that we came up with that was not noted by Gardner was prismatic blades. It's largely an old world. It was originally thought and developed in the old world. It's in Asia, it's all across the Paleolithic, Upper Paleolithic primarily. And so, a fellow named Mike Collins in Texas, who did the Galt pre-Clovis, there's pre-Clovis and Clovis site in Texas called the Galt site. And he was doing the work on that, but he'd been in Texas forever. And they were finding caches of these blades that look like these. And so these were Clovis age. So he wrote the book on Clovis blade technology. Problem is, and I'll get to the bias stuff like this does, and I'm not blaming Mike Collins. He was doing one thing, but archaeologists who will glom onto that, and all of a sudden, Clovis blades have to be big blades. There are no blades other than Clovis for Clovis, because the big blades are all that they've got in Clovis. Well, we'll demonstrate that's not the case. But anyway, this is a conical blade core, and this is what's called a single crested corner or starter blade. It's got one crest right down here, and it's a corner blade because it's one that they knock off an edge in order to create the ridges down which they would strike these individual blades. Each one of these is backed by a ridge. Now, I'll get to that technology bias. I've already discussed the one here. The other one is Bob's and my colleague and mentor. I took a class from him in 1975 at Catholic University on lithic technology. And Eric's dissertation, Eric Callahan's dissertation, was on biface technician and fluted point tradition in the Eastern fluted point tradition, but he was focusing on Thunderbird. A lot of it was worked on Thunderbird. And he was doing bifaces because back then, making the spear points was a big deal. The Clovis point was what everybody was trying to learn to do. Moi too. And so he was doing that, but he wasn't addressing blades. And so what that did, that influenced an awful lot of archaeologists to ignore blades. He was one of the best blade makers I've ever seen. Wasn't that he didn't know what he was doing, he knew exactly what he was doing. But it's the archaeologists that take these guru documents and then apply them, and because they're not lithic technologists will go off on will not go off and look at the context and look at the other things that are out there. Okay, blades. We've got all kinds of blades. Now this right down here, this is a real eye-opener. This is a feature that I excavated personally at Cactus Hill, 8 inches below Clovis. And it was every one of these pieces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These are blades, these 4. This is 2 pieces of the same point, found 5 inches from each other, and every artifact on here touched 48 inches below datum. Measured the same depth on a 6-foot-long line, probably at the edge of a structure or something, or been trapped by erosion against something. But anyway, these are blades. These are 18,000 years ago. So we've got blades back here. Why they've got blades here? Of course, this probably is a continuous blade tradition. We don't know yet on the early Archaic whether it kept going or how long it kept going for certain. Some thought says that it ended in the early Archaic. But we got blades in quartzite off the site, and rhyolite. I mean, not rhyolite, quartzite and greenstone. So we're still fishing there. Kurt's doing his master's thesis to try to help us on that. So then we got the big blades, the kind we would expect from the Mike Collins's book. And we got big curved ones, like these curves. We got the curved blades. And we got the big ones with the big center ridges coming down them. And surprisingly not, Jasper Ridge, we've got corner blades, 2 of them, which are a sign that we're dealing with a sophisticated blade technology there. That it isn't just accidental. This one and this one come from the Thunderbird collection. That's a big corner blade. That fits Clovis, and that's right out of the Thunderbird excavation. And going back through everything there. I guess I'm about halfway through it. So, we've got an interesting blade thing, but we got more. Here, we've got double crested blades. This is a single crested. This is one of the big single crested blades, normal, big ones that Collins is talking about. Here's another one. Here's a really nice double crested blade, which, in order to flake one of these, this is a valley. You know, see, this is a large crest. This is a ridge. Here, you have valleys that they're flaking into. And most of us, when we were learning to do this stuff, learned never flake into a concavity. But I don't know. I first noticed this with a fluted point that I'll show you later, and then maybe the next slide. But I first noticed it in mass when we did the material from the quarry. There were quite a few of them there, and some of it's accidental, possibly. But this shows you here. This is where it was struck. This flake, they actually flaked here to make that concavity deeper. Now, I think I know why they did it, but it's a little more technical. It's a technical aspect, so I won't go into that. Just, no, by the way, a guy named John Withoff back in the 1950s did the Shoup site in Pennsylvania and noted that about 80% of his tools were made on prismatic blades. And he even mentioned when you cross-section, like you cross-section one of these, it's a triangle. When you cross-section one of these, it's a trapezoid. So they're different. And you almost have to be knowing what you're doing to get into this stuff. Because you're flaking into something. This is the platform from that. Here's the first flake that came off that left this hole. Now this is not, that's not actually, this is what they look like. These two don't fit together. But this shows the platform struck here for that. Then this is the next one that was struck right in the concavity here. And that's how you do this. And here it is. This was found in the Nottoway when we were doing our pre-Clovis research. This was excavated 3 feet below the surface. And there's the cast of it up here with a quartzite adze that was found on the same level. Here's the ridge for this side of the flake, and here's the ridge for the other side. They were doing that, flaking into this hole, and here's one from South Carolina or Georgia of this type of point, where they're doing similar things. So this is a technology that I think we really need to get into that we haven't been over the years, if we're going to study these technologies. Okay, well, Bob, you want to talk about where you're going with the experimental work?
Sure.
This is your call.
That's right.
I didn't do that other thing. I thought that was hokey. I'd rather have a picture of you in there,
Thanks.
actually doing it.
Go ahead, you finish first.
I did.
You done?
Wait a minute, I'll show you. Ta-da! Conifer forest, tundra, grassland, mixed conifer deciduous. There's no modern analog for Ice Age environments. So we will back up so you can see. Well, I hope we'll back up. Yeah, yeah. It's all yours.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Oh, here's the pointer. Oh, you don't have any slides.
No slides.
Unless you want to.
And I'll be brief. I know everybody's got to go to the bathroom, just like me. So I won't talk long. I am Bob Richards. I am the owner of Jasper Ridge. I bought Jasper Ridge knowing that it was a Jasper quarry, and that the Jasper quarry for Thunderbird had never been studied. You know, if you do the research on Thunderbird and all of its sites, they never looked at the quarry. So I thought it really needed to be looked at hard. I am not an archaeologist. I look at myself as one of Mike Johnson's lieutenants. And we are so blessed and fortunate to have Mike, who is a world-renowned paleoarchaeologist, working with us on this site. I can't thank Mike enough for working with us on this. And you know, I love history, just like I'm sure all of you love history. It's why you're here. And when I think over time, one of the things that really attracts me to this paleo world is these were humans that were coming into the Americas, to an area that there were no humans there. It was a new environment for them. They didn't have to fight with their neighbors about land rights. They didn't have to fight with their neighbors about their religious beliefs, you know. And I don't want to make it sound too idyllic, because it wasn't idyllic at all. You know, Mike already told you that if they hiked 2 weeks or 3 weeks to the north, there were ice sheets a mile thick there. And it was a completely different biome, you know. It was Arctic, and they were probably hunting caribou, they were probably hunting the mastodon, woolly mammoth. But if their child went out of the hut during the night to look at the stars, there's a good chance they might be swiped by a saber-toothed tiger, or a direwolf, or a flat-faced bear. So survival was tough. It wasn't an idyllic situation for them. Survival was what it was all about. But I'm sure that they were always looking for other people to interact with. They needed those rendezvous sites. They needed to be able to trade technology. They needed to be able to trade learning. And so, you know, for me, it's looking at these Thunderbird peoples of Virginia and trying to understand their culture a little bit. What was their culture? And unfortunately, not much of it is left behind for us. We think, we surmise that they used a lot of wood tools. They used a lot of antler tools. They used a lot of bone tools. But none of those are left behind. All we really have is the Jasper left behind for us. And that gets me to one of the things that brought me to all this, and that is, I love to Flint Run. You know, I'm not really a collector of points. I like to think of myself as a maker of points. I want to know, how did they make these tools? Not just the points, but how did they make their tools? And the people here were using Jasper. I'm from Lynchburg. I grew up in Lynchburg, and Eric Callahan, that Mike mentioned, was one of my good friends and my mentor in flint knapping in Lynchburg. And I was so fortunate to have Eric as really a world-class mentor there. And as Eric grew older, he passed away about 3 years ago. Probably for the last decade, he kept telling me, Bob, you need to go to Front Royal and you need to meet Scott Silsby. And I never had time to do it until Eric passed away. And then he passed away, and I came up here and met Scott Silsby. Is Scott here?
Yeah, he's back there.
Scott, will you just raise your hand? Scott is a master napper. He's a world-renowned master napper and Lithic technologist. So, you know, I had Eric Callahan in Lynchburg. You have Scott Silsby here at Front Royal if you don't know him. And so Scott kind of led me into Jasper Ridge, and I was asking, I said, Scott, we need an archaeologist to help us work this site. He said, well, you want Mike Johnson, but you can't get him because he's retired. Now he likes to mine for gold. So I called one of my friends in Utah and said, Greg, I need an archaeologist. And he said, well, you want Mike Johnson? Well, so that following weekend, this was only 5 days later, Greg was invited down to the Sunrise site in Wyoming, which is a paleo site down there, to evaluate it. And they had invited 4 archaeologists to come down there and evaluate it. And Mike was one of those. And Greg talked to Mike and told him what we were doing. And Mike said, yeah, I'd maybe be interested in that. So Greg called me that night. And so I called Mike that weekend, and that's how we caught up with Mike. And Mike agreed to come look at this and work on this with us. So that's kind of why I'm here. And again, I'm a flint knapper, and so my objective is to work with what we have left, and that's the jasper, it's the stone tools. And I want to understand, how did they make their jasper stone tools? You know, you can find stone tools of all different types everywhere else, but jasper's here. This is our Virginia stones. It's here, it's right here. And these Thunderbird people were using jasper. So what I want to understand is, how were they making their tools? And of course, that was influenced by what did they need, and the quality of the stone, and the quantity of the stone that they had. And I think that they really had three production pathways. So we'll get just technical for just a minute. Three production pathways as they worked this stone. And the first production pathway would be the biface pathway. And the biface pathway would end with a point, like a Clovis point. But as you worked that stone down, as you took it down, took off flakes, 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 first you'd end up with something like a mattock, and then a hoe, and then a chopper, and then an axe, and then a knife, and then finally a biface point. So you have all kinds of tools as you went down that production pathway. And every single flake that came off of that biface was a razor blade. Every single flake could be used to skin a rabbit, or to cut your breakfast, or whatever you needed. So all those tools were there. So that's production pathway number one. It's the biface pathway. The second pathway would have been the blade core pathway that Mike showed you. It's a conical formation that you would create. You had to create that conical piece of rock. So the biface pathway, they wanted to use really good jasper. The blade core pathway, they wanted to use really good jasper. Jasper comes in all different qualities. There's really good stuff, and there's really crappy stuff, and there's everything in between. So these people, Thunderbird people, were looking for the good rock. And the good rock would go down the biface pathway. The good rock, depending upon its shape, would go into the blade core pathway. And these blades were a great way to conserve your rock. You know, these people, we think they lived here, but they were also mobile. They had to go, and this rock was their toolkit. They couldn't go to Western Auto or to Sears or wherever that store may have been and got tools. They had to carry their tools with them. And you had to conserve your tools because you didn't know when you were going to find good rock again. And so that blade core, you could get 100 razor blades off of that blade core. And each of those blades could be broken and turned into various tools. So it's a great way to conserve your rock. You wanted really good jasper for that blade core. So that's production pathway number two. And then production pathway number three is flake cores. And this is the good jasper that's not quite that good. If you grade it on a 10 scale, maybe this was a 7 or an 8, not the 10 stuff. And so this was blocky stuff that they were knocking off great big flakes from. And these big flakes, you could make great scrapers and great multi-tools, as Mike showed you some of those. And so what I'd like to know is, okay, well, how did they do this? How did they do this? What tools did they use? We think we know what tools they used. They used the tools they had. They used hard hammer stones, soft hammer stones, antler, deer, and maybe ivory, and various types of elk and moose antlers that they had as hard percussors. They used the antler for pressures, for pressure flaking. So we think they know how they did it, but of course we can't go back there and watch how they did it. But what we can do is we can create these tools, going down a pathway that we think they use. We can look at our debitage, we can look at air flakes, we can analyze those, and then we can look at all these flakes that we're finding in the field and see, well, how do ours compare to theirs? Do they look the same? Can we look at various characteristics and say that we think we're doing it right? This is how we think they made them. So we can compare our debitage to their debitage. And then just as importantly for me, it's so much fun when we're in the field and we're digging screens and screens and you find a flake and you say, that is a beautiful flake. Look at that flake. And that happened to us today and yesterday. We found some beautiful flakes. I mean, a flake that's just beautiful. And you can look at it and you say, that came off of a biface. And the person that made that was a master. And you can say, ooh, there's There's the platform where it was hit. We know it was isolated, it was released, it crossed the center line, and you can just say, that's a beautiful flake. And we can say that because we know how to make these things. So it's nice for us to be able to look at the debitage that we find and say, did it come from a biface pathway? Did it come from a blade core pathway? Did it come from a flake core pathway? So that's really where it is for me. And again, it's so nice for me to have people like Mike Johnson and Scott Silsby, who are world-class nappers that are still my mentors. And I'd just like to finish with a couple sayings that my mentor, Eric Callahan, would have said. He would have said about the Jasper, the rock is not asleep. It's following all the laws of the universe. And when you're flint napping, it's like playing chess with the master of the universe. So the rock has its own spirit. And we're chasing the spirit of the Jasper. We're chasing the spirit of the Thunderbird peoples of Virginia. And that's what we're studying. So thank you for coming. I'd love to answer questions.
Does anyone have any questions? Now would be the time to raise your hand and throw it out there. Yes, please go ahead.
I grew up in Markwell, Albuquerque, and I was a child. I went out to Thunderbird, like 75, 76, and I got very excited about what I just saw out there, learned to recognize Jasper. So I think I remember being told that Jasper, the chloride, when it got heated, Jasper's chloride was the tannish color. When it got heated, it would change to the reddish color. Is that correct, or am I remembering that wrong?
It can change.
Okay.
It doesn't always change. The stuff we've got, we separate the stuff in the lab. The only stuff we put in the heated trial, the thermally altered category, is stuff that's red. But we know from the looks of some of this stuff that we're finding, like those spurs that I pointed out that have the reddened tip, the rest of it wasn't red.
Right.
So it can redden it. Now this site, because so much of what we're finding has been pot lidded and scalded and scorched, I think maybe one of those grass areas caught fire. I think the whole site's been cooked from the looks of what we're finding. Now that doesn't mean that all of it is cooked the same, because it was probably at different depths. Or certain areas burned hotter than others, but we don't know that yet. That's one of the things, we're looking at some scientific possibilities, like looking at the magnetism of them, because the heat alteration makes them magnetic. And so we can either say they're magnetic or they're not by running a magnet by them. But when we did that, we found that some were more magnetic than others. And so if we can find a way to determine how magnetic, find some sort of a way to say, no, this is a 2 magnetic and this is an 8. And we can go through them and we say, well, all of these are 8. Let's put all the 8s together and look at those, and let's look at the 2s together. Because maybe that's a key in a disturbed site where everything's mixed up over 4,000 years or more, that we can connect artifacts across the site. First we take that one variable, which is heat altering, and there's another one called X-ray fluorescence that might work well on this, but we don't know. We're planning an experimental test on whether that works. The idea is to see if we can put this stuff back together across that site in some ways. We never get it all, but just if we can get part of it put together, where we can say, okay, this, and there's also cross-mending. See, this will help us by cross-mending, I mean, if you saw all those blades that were in that circle, they came from the same stone, and so they should read the same. And if over time the plow or people moving them around scatters them out, we can then draw lines between the ones that match and get an idea of where that activity took place on the site. And maybe if we're lucky, find the broken tool that went with it, find out what they were doing with those flakes, what they were trying to do with it.
Thank you.
How hard is a Jasper? Is it on Mohs scale or?
Yeah, on the Mohs scale on, what is it, 7 probably, something like that? It's as hard as quartz, because it's mostly silicon. But quartz, Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, it's amazing how variable it is. You know, I grade it from 0 to 10. And 10 is like glass. It's so easy to nap. But you get down to 7, and it's very difficult. So 7, you really need to heat treat it. You need to put it 4 inches under a campfire and cook it overnight if you want to biface it. You can actually get some big flakes off for flake core. But if you want to biface it, you need to put it 4 inches under a campfire, cook it overnight, and heat redden it. And then it actually comes up probably to an 8 or maybe even a 9. So it depends upon the quality of the jasper.
One thing back years ago, when Bill Gardner had a thing called, what he called lithic determinism, that the Clovis age nappers were wedded, they were tethered, as he would use the term, to the jasper sources or the high quality flint or chert sources. And they really didn't pay much attention to the other materials. But in late 80s, I did a paper on the lithic technology and material culture of the first Virginians. And I used the McCary survey at that time, which had recorded some 600 fluted points, 640 or something like that. And I found that 9% of those, a little more than 9%, were made of quartzite. And another 13% plus were made of quartz in Virginia. Now, all of the quartzite were essentially east of 95 in the coastal plain, where you get a lot of quartzite in the streams from outwash. The quartz was evenly distributed between the coastal plain and the Piedmont, with only one on this side of the Blue Ridge, which means that Gardner was being heavily influenced by Thunderbird. And that goes to the thing where I was saying about they didn't need to go very far. So you weren't getting odd stuff in, and that's why that little quartz thing, if it's a channel flake, is hugely important. It doesn't belong. A fluid point does not belong being made of quartz on that site if that was a determining factor, the raw material. So quartz may have had, that piece of quartz may have had something really special to get them to actually work it on a jasper quarry. It says something about the way they may have thought and their thinking in terms of, and that goes to another key, is that the fluid point manufacturers, as we found out, were working any kind of raw material. And Eric did a chart in his dissertation on the toughness of the materials. And he had obsidian, which is essentially glass, all the way down to quartzite and rhyolite and quartz at the bottom as being tough. Well, it turns out he had it flipped, at least on those materials, because the flint nappers, whenever they went in, they went right for obsidian, then they went to chert. They didn't even mess with quartz and quartzite. But eventually when they tried, because the artifacts were made out of quartz and quartzite, it was almost impossible. Why? Because chert is tough and resilient. You set up chert and you can get what you want. You can predict. I saw Eric in our class use a Sharpie to draw the flake that was going to come off the biface that he was going to hit. And the trick was, a large section of that flake that came off had only half of the Sharpie marker on it. The other half was still on the piece that he drew it off of, because he could predict what was going to happen down to that precise. However, quartz and quartzite, they're brittle. And the reason we had trouble with it for such a long time was because we were overpowering the flint nappers. The problem wasn't the prehistoric people, it was modern flint nappers. We learned on chert, so we had to develop this technique of how it's supposed to work. And we then transferred to quartz and quartzite, and we destroyed whatever we were dealing with because we were overpowering the poor little biface we were working on in quartz and quartzite. And so what's learned to do was to back off. And so all of a sudden, we can work quartz and quartzite. In fact, some people try different materials, like try working with wood, so they don't have to change their technique. I think these people up here, because of what Bob's talking about with the variation in the material, they learned how to work it by changing themselves through those materials. They may not have had to heat alter everything to get it there. They may have understood they could, if they they never understood what it took to take it off distinctly. And Scott mentioned that right from the beginning, they were most likely after that primo material, but that primo material is locked up in material that isn't. So you got to get rid of the other stuff in order to get to the good stuff. And knowing how to work the stuff that isn't any good to get to the good stuff is an important thing to know.
Another question? Sure, yes, sir.
Earlier you noted during one of the excavations about a person's shadow being observed or noted.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate in a little bit more
Sure.
detail on how that was identified, the particulars of that?
What they did was, the Thunderbird, the people who were doing the Thunderbird site, they were mapping everything. Now, I don't know if, everything above a certain size, I believe it was. And so all the flakes, from when you're sitting there, like I'm right here, okay? And I'm gonna be napping, putting the thing on my leg, and I'm gonna be knocking, and stuff falls off in between. And then a little bit of it goes over here in the process, because I may go over here to set up an edge. And so we'll drop some there, and then here. And then it does spread out around there in terms of the process. And so it doesn't end up under your butt. It's not there.
Cross-legged, had one leg across,
Yeah,
that made that sort of figure four pattern,
yeah.
which is good argument to be made. I didn't see it myself, but they saw it.
Yeah, well, it's actually, they have a picture of the actual thing in the National Geographic thing from the 1970s of that location. There's a geographic article on the paleo in America, and that part is in there. It's a little sidebar, but it's there. Trust me, trust me.
You sit on your butt on the ground and try to map, it doesn't work. It worked for the Clovis, but it didn't work for us.
Yeah. But we sit on a chair that is otherwise known as a bucket, and it's turned over. Then it becomes a chair when it's turned over.
Any other questions? Right in the front, please.
Whatever happened to the Thunderbird Museum? I went there when I was a kid.
I
mean,
spent my life in there. Every chance I got, I was in there, because that was the most fantastic museum I had ever seen, and it's pretty much the most fantastic one I have seen since then. It was that high a quality. The material was taken out. The artifacts and stuff are in the Smithsonian, over in Suitland, and I'm going through the stuff. You know, well, my wife broke her hip, and so I've been out of business for better than a month going over there. So it's reduced. I've up to 300 and some blades going through there. But most of that went there. I don't know what happened. Like, I'm still in my mind's eye see this most incredible piece of number 10 Jasper that was right inside the door as you walked in. It was probably about this big around. Big, huge piece of brown jasper that was sort of, as I recall, layered between brown and yellow. And it was just, I don't know where that is. You know, maybe Eric got it. I have no idea.
Yeah, I remember it was real fantastic.
That was beautiful. And I learned so much from going through that repeatedly. You know, what they did. They did some of the best work that was being done at the time. It was so far ahead. And now when we say there's differences now, you know, things we're learning, we're building on what they did. Because if they hadn't done what they did, we would only know about the upland site. We would know about the winter camp and the kill site that's 50, the 50 site. We would know about those if they hadn't done that work. And we can build on what they did. And that's essentially what we've done here. We haven't changed what Gardner's model was. We've just made it fuller.
Question, Brian?
Oh, yeah, you mentioned the site shows occupation over a range of about 4,000 years.
No, that's 4,000 years was the latest we've got.
4,000 years before present, you mean?
Yeah. And it goes
So
back
it's a
to at
long
least
range.
13. It goes back to at least 13,000, so it's 9,000 years of stuff we've got there.
Okay. It has pre-Clovis in it.
We don't know that. It
Okay.
might, but that's going to be almost, I think almost impossible unless we find a Cactus Hill-like point there.
Oh, yeah.
That's the only thing I can think of that's gonna tell us, because it's all mixed up. And
Is
the
there a
point's the only
complete
reason-
stratigraphic section of that time interval anyplace nearby?
Well, we're
Well-
hoping that when we come off the ridge.
We
that
might find
We
something
might
there.
find some stratified areas.
And
Yeah.
Thunderbird, that reminds me, when I,
Like, your site's all bedrock mostly?
Well,
Well-
when you're on top of the ridge, we go down probably 8 to 20 inches, and we're hitting breaking down bedrock. Yes.
decomposed, saprolite
Saprolite.
type
So the
stuff.
people
Well, you
that
can
are-
ask Scott about the geology.
You think they camped there at the workstation, or did
They
they head
camped up
down
on
toward
there.
the water?
Hmm?
Do you think they camped nearer the water?
We think we have a spring right
There's
on
a
the
spring
side.
right next to it, and there's a spring on either side. That
So you-
probably would have been active then.
Bones?
Not gonna be
Well,
there.
That
Bones
might be
would-
down in the, down in the lower end, down in the limestone, if you get it, if you get down in the sinkhole.
You'd have to
something
get in
like
a dry
that.
cave,
Yeah.
anything like that preserved.
Did they
It's,
bury their dead?
Hmm?
Did they bury their dead?
We don't know.
Nobody's ever found Clovis burial, that's for certain. They have the Anzic burial up in, Montana, but that's been iffy. It's a child burial, but that's in Montana. But in the east, we have, when I did the paper back in the 80s, there were 6 bones that were found with Clovis sites, and I think 3 of them were caribou.
Hmm.
And they were fragments, and they were iffy too, probably, even the caribou. The caribou bone in the Pleistocene was all the way down to Saltville. And they excavated down in Saltville in southwest Virginia, almost the entire skeleton of a muskox from the Pleistocene. So it was pretty cold during the full glaciation down here.
How confident are you about that paleo wind direction thing?
The wind,
Yeah.
the logic fits, and the U.S. Geological Survey was a team that we helped when we were over at Cactus Hill and working down there in the Nottoway, because they wanted to date the dunes, the dune structures. And they dated the dune structures to around 30,000 years ago. And they knew what it would take to move that kind of sand up onto those dunes, off the floodplains.
Is beach dunes?
No, these are Aeolian wind off the
Okay.
floodplains. And it picked up some fairly decent size. Oh, I'm reminded of driving through Wyoming when the wind was blowing 30 or 40 miles an hour and having a pebble crack my windshield that was picked up by the wind, not by a truck, picked up by the wind. And so.
Is there a black mat layer there, or anywhere
No.
nearby?
Not that we know of. Is that, you're talking about the Younger Dryas boundary?
Yeah.
That's an important aspect that I didn't really talk about much, because that was 12,800 years ago, and like 35 species of animals came up to that and went extinct. It's an extinction event, the onset of the Younger Dryas. We don't have elephants past then, we don't have short-faced bears, we don't have saber-toothed tigers or any of that past that time when that Younger Dryas happened. Even the Clovis doesn't really go past it. So if it's wiping out all those animals, it's probably doing a similar job to the people that were here in the east. You'd have to do that with a stratified site. And there are 2 big stratified sites, are Shawnee Minisink in the upper Delaware. It's 10 feet below the surface, close to 10 feet below the surface, and Thunderbird. Thunderbird hadn't been looked at in a long time, since hadn't been opened up since the late 70s, down to the Paleo Belt. And I remember going through the artifacts for that paper that I did back in the late 80s, and I looked at the Thunderbird material, because that was the best I had on lithic technology. And I remember some triangular points down there. I remember some triangular points in there that they were blowing off, because Gardner never accepted pre-Clovis, at least not since I remember it. And he was saying that those were trickled down from the woodland. These triangular points are common as arrow points in the late woodland. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, what was I looking at? I do remember seeing them and being told that they were woodland, but that was before we knew anything about
Yeah.
pre-Clovis.
Yeah.
I was accepting whatever was, the prevailing wisdom at the time.
So what we're talking about here, what we're talking about is we're thinking that the environment was warming up, warming. The ice sheets were melting until about 12,800 years ago. And we think that maybe there was an impact, a comet or meteorite impact over the ice sheets, which vaporized a lot of ice. into the atmosphere, steam, came down as snow, 50, 60 feet of snow, and wiped out our Thunderbird Clovis people, wiped out these species of great woolly mammoths and mastodons, and basically wiped out, all of North America except down in the refugiums of the Mississippi Valley and down to the south in Florida.
Southwest.
And that brought on what's called the Younger Dryas, which was a mini ice age. And then we think those people came back from the south, bringing different types of Clovis points back into the north again. So that's what we're talking about, that black layer. Is there something we can identify as an impact site to say, okay, yes, looks like there was an impact?
One quick thing. We have a couple other questions. Mike, I wanted to ask you both a question while we have everybody here, and they're two fast questions. Are there other sites in North America as old as what we have here in Warren County, and if so, how many?
Oh, I couldn't count them, but there's sites, there's a new site, there's new stuff that's out in, in Idaho, Montana. Yeah, and then you have those footprints from White Sands that are between 20 and 23,000 years ago. And Cactus Hill, it sits on a terrace on the south side of the Nottoway River. And the way I like to put it, you have a pissant little site, okay, sitting on a pissant little terrace, on a pissant little tributary of the Roanoke River, which is a pissant little river when you look at the continent, that flows into the Atlantic Ocean. And how'd they get there? They didn't land there from a spaceship didn't drop them there. They knew where they were. They knew how to find that location, and that location was a part of their settlement pattern, which meant they'd been there a while. They couldn't have just, they didn't go trekking from the ice-free corridor across the Atlantic and go there, unless there was some reason there, there was a beam of light from space or something, to take them there. Our antiquity, I at a meeting in Santa Fe back in 2013, the guy who was given the close up on it, because it was the definitive meeting to say the Clovis first model is dead. But what we need to do now is start back. Instead of going from now back, we need to start going back to come forward. We need to get older than 30,000 and back and start looking in those landforms that my dissertation opens up with. If you want to find old sites, you got to find old dirt. There's a site in the 80s that was excavated in Oklahoma, 16 feet below the surface. It's called Burnham. And they found a bison that went extinct 30,000 years ago with flakes that came from 100 miles away. So that was probably scavenged, but by whom?
Speaking about like an impact crater or volcanic cold air or something like that, have you ever noticed around from where the Skyline Drive Park is up there, round town area? It's almost
Basin.
It's almost like
You're talking about Gooney Creek.
all the way to Bentonville,
Yeah.
back around. It's like a crater in the mountain.
Well, I noticed that when I exercise in front of a big map, topo map of Virginia.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking at that all the time.
Yeah.
You've been very patient.
I just wanted to comment, at one point in time, the visitor center at Shenandoah River State Park, Andy Guest State Park, had information and a display about Thunderbird. So that's, maybe you already knew.
I wonder
that.
who put it, well,
I
that
don't-
probably
I
was
don't
Joan.
know.
That was probably that may have been Bill and Joan Walker.
I have no idea, but I
Because-
just thought I'd
yeah.
comment in case you said you were looking for some of that.
Well, I understand, we just scratching the surface, we're looking at one site. This complex, they didn't just sit on Jasper Ridge. When you take a look at those view sheds, the purpose of what they were doing those view sheds for was to find out where they were gonna go hunting. And if it took going to the Blue Ridge, it wasn't gonna be done in one day. So there were gonna be campsites, and they knew the habits of the animals that were living there. Talk about the caribou patterns. They knew those animals intimately, just like the people that hunt caribou, the Native American, the Inuit up in Alaska who hunt caribou. They knew before the caribou began to move that they were gonna move.
Have you seen any evidence of buffalo jumps like they have?
No. They might have had bison here in the valley, because
Yeah.
there have been bison. There was bison in the east, even in the European contact. question in front there.
Oh, it's more an expression of frustration. For years, I've been reading this argument about how Clovis had to be the first people, or Clovis people, and part of the reason for that was that they couldn't have come down the coast until the ice melted back. Well, nobody walked down the coast. Remember that you're not only carrying yourself, you're carrying your supplies, you're carrying tents, you're carrying tools, you're carrying children, and you have no animals to help you. They came down in boats. Every culture that we have ever found, if they were anywhere near any kind of water, had boats. They came down the coast in the boats, and they just went out to where the water was and came down. And if the ice was 2 miles out, they went around it.
In 2012, Dennis Stanford and Bruce Bradley published a book called Across Atlantic Ice, where they hypothesized that the Solutrean, the people who did the cave paintings, who did stuff like this, got across the Atlantic by working along the ice edge from the pack ice that was covering all the way down to northern France in the winter. And they were hunting seals and auks.
Wow.
We don't have auks out there, but they were hunting that. You got to remember, the sea level was down 350 feet. And so the Grand Banks were exposed.
Oh, yeah.
So Peggy Jodrey is big on that at the Smithsonian, on the idea of boats. And I first heard it in 1988 at a conference by a woman named Ruth Groom from South America, doing South American archaeology, that she was proposing that we know that people got to Australia 40, 50,000 years ago. And the only way they could have done that was by boat. And so there on the Pacific Rim, you have a logical progression for people migrating along that rim and getting into North America pretty early, maybe.
Well, Monte Verde, all the way down at the southern tip of South America, is one of the oldest well-dated sites.
And that's how they got there. They sailed down the coast.
Yeah.
Or possibly came across.
But they probably knew about sails too.
There is some.
All you had to do is stand in that wind once, and you know how a sail works. It's the first time it blew your house down. You know what a sail was. You know how to use a sail.
So Mike, just while we have everyone here still, what's one of the challenges that you're having as lead archaeologist? I mean, I heard a lot of debitage, a lot of waste, a lot of chips. Where are the broken tools? Where are all the pieces? Were they packed out?
Well, we think this site was collected heavily, particularly during the 70s. When Thunderbird was what, 3 miles, maybe 3 miles away, if that much? Because actually, if you went with the crow flies, it's probably not even a mile away. It's across the Shenandoah. But if you go, if you went the way we used to, using the amphibious duck from the museum across the fields and through the river and up, over there to get there, it was a little longer. But yeah, it was not very far away. So, what was the question?
Do you think that any artifacts that were there have exited?
Yeah, we think they have. And we have no idea where they are, and that's one of the problems you have. If you're not recording the artifacts or where they came from, then once you're gone, they're lost. They're lost, and they're not. Fortunately, in collecting, as I've done controlled surface collections on entire 400 by 600 foot plowed fields. And you have to teach the crew in our area, don't look for the quartz. You'll see the quartz. You gotta look for the brown, dark color. In that way, and we rhyolite looks like the stubble from corn plowing. So we call those corn chips when we pick up the corn, thinking it's a rhyolite flake. But I think that, yeah, that's an issue, and I don't know if we'll ever resolve that. Because the idea would be is if we were lucky to find someone who was connected to the site. One of the sites is called Lockhart, the paleo sites at Thunderbird. There was one right across the river from it. And every time I drive here, right here on the corner, there's a repair shop or something like that, this is Lockhart. And I'm thinking, oh man, I need to stop there, I need to talk to these people, see if they know the people who were living there, and might give us some clue as to what happened back then, and where we may be able to find some of the material that was picked up, just to record it. I mean, we're not the government, obviously. We're not there to take anybody's stuff. We have enough to do than to get into that.
Thank you.
I found a fossil of a sea creature on top of Blue Mountain, like on the surface in the woods. Was that ever underwater at any time?
Probably because maybe 400, 500 million years ago, and a fossil would be there. Because remember, before Pangea, you're looking at flat. When the two continents came together, they turned things up and pushed things up. That's how Darwin, when he was in South America, found the fossilized seashells on top of a mountain. And he didn't know what the heck what they were doing up there. And so that's where he came up with the theory of evolution. It was essentially based on that stimulating his mind to say, well, wait a minute, something's going on here. Well, the geology, of course, helps. If you understand the geology, you understand that up there. We have at Cactus Hill, Blueberry Hill, one of the site near Cactus Hill, in level 17 down with the pre-Clovis material, you've got a crinoid bead. Now, a crinoid is a crinoid stem for an underwater plant, animal. It has a stem that's flexible, and it has at the top, it has a tentacle type of thing at the top to catch stuff. And the stem is in segments. And the segments are, real small. These things aren't they're this big. But the bead is only like that. And I got to the geology people at Virginia, over in Charlottesville, and they said, well, the nearest crinoid bead to be found in Virginia is 100 miles away on the other side of the Blue Ridge. So how in the heck did it get to the Cactus Hill site in pre-Clovis time? Which means these people they knew where they were, and they knew how to get around even back then, that far. So most of your fossils are found in the uplands. They're not found, even sea creatures, trilobites and stuff are found in the uplands. They're not found in the water.
Remember, all the bicarbonates of the Shenandoah Valley were formed by sea
Yes,
creatures.
sea creatures died.
Limestone. All the limestone was formed by
Sea creatures.
inland underwater seas. That material settled
And
down.
that's before Pangea,
a million years.
in the Shenandoah Valley,
Right.
where you've got the limestone. And that's still relatively flat.
Well, at one time, the entire Great Plains was ocean.
Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, Triassic and, earlier.
So there was a mountain range before the Blue Ridge,
Yeah.
called the Grenville Mountains, that completely eroded down.
He owns them. He owns the last of them.
I live on the Lynchburg Formation, and that's actually was formed by debris that came from the Grenville Mountains, pushed back up when Pangea formed. Again. So all of our metamorphic rock in the Blue Ridge came from the erosion process of the Grenville Mountains getting pushed back up into the Blue Ridge Mountains. All that metamorphic rock had to come from somewhere. So,
Yeah, recycling.
Yeah, it was recycled rock. So yes, those fossils can definitely be found on the top of the mountain.
Some people in the back may not be getting
Yeah, any other questions?
way back.
Well, right here.
Yeah, this is much more recent, but the Powhatan in the 16th and 17th centuries were heat treating quartzite and getting jasper from Virginia to use for their flint knapping. And I was just wondering because I don't know where they were getting the jasper from. Is this the site or around here where they would have been getting it from?
On that early slide, there were two other locations that we know about. And there was one in the James River Valley that I don't remember where, I don't know where it was, up the James River. But there's one on in the Rappahannock drainage, the Brook Run site, which was an incredible site. They were doing a VDOT, was doing a test for widening Route 3. And one of the shovel tests by the crew that was doing it, 700 jasper flakes. One of the shovel tests. So as much as VDOT weaseled as much as they could to get out of it, they couldn't get out of doing the archaeology there. The evil empire, we used to call it. Anyway, so they did it, and they did it up brown. I mean, they spent money and they put up a structure, and they had tours, and they had signs out on the road, come see this, and all that sort of stuff. Because they had to do it. And it was a Jasper quarry on the other side of the Blue Ridge, which is a shocker, where nobody would ever expect it. It was it was about 14 feet deep by 20 feet long that they excavated, by as narrow as this and maybe that people were going down in. And the earliest carbon dates that they got, the oldest carbon dates they got, well, they were the only carbon dates they got, I think, were early archaic. Were 11,000 years ago. And that, that's the early archaic. And so they were saying, well, we don't have paleo. And of course, the guy who's a soil scientist and I are saying, what's going on with these people? That's the latest thing, that was the last thing that was there. Because the paleo had already dug through down there and all their debris was thrown out of it in order to get to the good Jasper by the people who were there later. If there were paleo there.
They were up there.
Yeah, it's all been dumped out of the quarry. So you're getting the last people who were there, not the first.
And one more Jasper site, down
And
in my backyard,
Yeah.
down near Lynchburg, near
I think that may be
Natural
it.
Bridge.
I think that's it, the one I was talking about, I don't know where it
This
is.
is right beside the Devil's Marble Yard, down close to Natural Bridge. And that's another Jasper site. That's on National Park Service.
And there's Point of Rocks up on the Potomac, up here. That had a big Jasper source, and there's a paleo site up there that American University found on the surface. But the Route 15 bridge crossing took out the Jasper. It's right at the point where the Jasper was. I think I may have seen a piece of it. Well, I've seen some of it that may have been work from the site.
And Mike mentioned earlier in this X-ray analysis of the rock that maybe we can start to determine where the Jasper was sourced from. You know, within their site, and you asked about the Powhatan, where did their stuff come from?
That would be the way.
That would be one way to maybe try to source some of
They've done it in Virginia. In other words, the Department of Historic Resources had one of their members go out and do a reading on all the Jasper sources. And at Smith Mountain Gap, which is down at Smith Mountain Lake, it's below the dam, they have one piece that matches up here, one piece of Jasper. So it seems like maybe the people from up here weren't going to that rendezvous. And you'd think, well, maybe so. They were going to the one on the Potomac. Because the Potomac goes way back in the interior, and if you're gonna have a rendezvous on the Potomac and go after the Atlantic salmon, you're gonna find the first big rapid, and that's where you all are gonna meet in the summertime, in the spring, when the salmon runs, because they're pretty hungry. The spring is a starving time, because all your stores have used up for the winter, and you're looking for something that's really gonna be quick, and nothing better than a fish run.
Sir, a couple questions. In the blue hat?
Yeah. When most of us hear quarry, we think of, maybe a quarter mile, half a mile downstream from where you are, there's a big limestone.
Yeah.
Is there any physical evidence at your site of actual digging and removal of Jasper, or is it just opportunistic picking up surface, exposed Jasper?
Well, I would just say that our site where the quarry was has been bulldozed. And until we run some of our transects, which we hope to do with this 10-foot interval down through that area, we won't really know the answer to that. We have a couple of sinkholes. When we look at those and say, is that a sinkhole or was that an old dig site? We don't know. But until we run some of our transects down through there, we don't really have an answer for that.
There is one thing, though, that there are a lot of large pieces of Jasper on the surface. And one of the reasons is Jasper does not erode very easily, whereas limestone does. And so that's why a lot of the Jasper around there is on the surface. And we don't know how long it's been on the surface. So you could have it, you drive along 340, and I've driven along there, and there's this lens of Jasper coming out of the bank right along the road that's eroding. I think it's pretty crappy stuff, but most of it is.
Lines, the river is now very low, probably 1.05 on the front road. So there's a lot of exposed bottom, but it's not at all uncommon to find jasper all over the river bottom.
Yep. That's what I do, I go fishing. I take my fly rod and then look for the jasper.
Another question back here, yes?
I have a couple. One is, I have a box of arrowheads I found in my grandmother's stuff. What do I do with it?
Well, we can look at it, or you still have it?
Second of all, I went to high school in Clovis, California. Where did Clovis name come from?
Oh, the Clovis name?
And the third question is, I found lots of jasper on my property, which is at the
Here? Around here?
I live in Reliance, right in Reliance.
I don't know where Reliance is.
Reliance is on, it's between Front Royal and Strauss. Northeast of 81.
Oh, it's north of town?
Yeah, it's between Front Royal and 81.
I know Jasper up there.
On the first.
We'd like to know about it. If you've got a Jasper, there's a Jasper source to add to the information.
I've noticed, I think it's jasper. I've noticed because I do a lot of digging on my property and I'm on a ridge.
Uh-huh.
And not a very high ridge, but just a mild ridge,
Mhm.
graded pasture land. And I do a lot of digging on my property and I found these pieces that I thought was jasper.
Well, at some point, we'd like to look at it.
Okay.
Yeah, see if it is, we can help you.
Okay.
Anyone else
No, I
have
don't
Jasper?
look- No, I'm a few miles from Jasper.
Oh, you do?
The name Clovis.
Where it came from? Well, originally it came from the first French king, I think. His name was Clovis. But the Clovis Point, and why it's called Clovis, was not because of exactly where it was found, but it was where the first railroad stop was, close to Portales, New Mexico. And it's Clovis, New Mexico. And they would come in to go down to Portales, which is where the Blackwater Draw site is located. And they have a wonderful museum. If you're ever in, go south from Interstate 40 and heading down toward, I guess, the next Interstate 20 or whatever's below that, or heading down that way, you go through Clovis, you go to Portales, and on the left, they have a museum that is an outstanding museum with the mammoth bones laying there, with the Clovis points on the ground, in the museum, and all the dioramas about how they've interpreted that site. That was the site that was first found in which Clovis points were found in association with mammoth. They had already found Folsom points a few years earlier. A black cowboy found it. He found it in association with a bison that was extinct. That's a Folsom point, which is a little later in the time frame than Clovis. And then when they got to Clovis Point, that was a big deal in terms of because we didn't have carbon dating back then in 1933, 32. So they had to find it in association with some sort of a animal they knew was from the Ice Age. And bingo, there they were, because the Folsom Point was stuck in the bone. So they knew that was associated. And the Clovis points were all mixed in and with the butchering tools, with the mammoth and the cut marks on the bones and all that sort of stuff.
Is there an origin for the Thunderbird name?
It was the person who was going to develop it was going to develop little houses down on they were selling lots, 5-acre lots, and that you could live down on do you have an add to that?
No, I have a different question.
Oh, wait, let me finish this one and I'll come back. And he called it the Thunderbird Ranch. And so they named the site after the owner because they had an agreement. They signed an agreement that for that part of the terrace, which was about 25 acres, it's 5 lots where the site is. They had an agreement that as long as they were digging there, they couldn't develop it. He wouldn't develop it. It was an agreement, so it was mutual. And finally, they were digging shovel tests to keep it from being developed. After they'd done all the work that they had and they'd gone off to start doing other archaeology, 10 years is a lot of time to spend on one site. Then a friend of mine met with Bill Gardner to go out and look at the site from the Northern Virginia chapter. And there was a bulldozer on the Thunderbird site, ready to build a house on there. So he came back, got Gardner to come into the Northern Virginia chapter and talk about it. And Steve Kimball and I said, we got to do something about this. So he started you take it. He started a campaign to get money to buy those lots. And a woman from Culpeper, Jan Townsend? No, can't remember her name. Oh, Sandra Speeden. Her husband owned like a 1,000-acre ranch down there. Was probably the wealthiest guy in there. Fell in love with the whole thing, and she took it on. And eventually, they got the state in a time when they had a surplus. The General Assembly had a surplus. We bought one. They got $25,000, enough to buy the site that was where the excavation was. I think that's it. And then the state appropriated the rest of the money to buy the rest of the site. And now it is owned by the Archaeological Conservancy. And if you go online, you can see there's a little show on the Thunderbird site there. They don't show you really much other than the woman talking about it and how important it was, and that they have other sites. So that's really essentially the story of Thunderbird.
I think we have time for one more question, and afterwards we
I
have
promise.
time if you want to.
She's so far in the back.
Yes.
So you mentioned the Delaware site having exotic stones and showing that there was a lot of movement at that time period. Did they not have any Jasper showing there was movement between here and up there, or is it just Jasper is only found here?
No. Actually, the sites in Delaware, the Shawnee Menacing site is Black Church, and not a lot of exotics. And the Shoup site is mostly what's called Onondaga Church from up in New York that got down there. But in southeastern Pennsylvania, there's the Veracruz Formation or quarries that is loaded with jasper. They have a lot of jasper in eastern Pennsylvania. It's a little different than the stuff here, but not so much so that sometimes they don't cross over and you can tell that they look alike. That you may not be able to separate the two. But jasper does occur there too. And there's other kinds of flint and chert that are all through the mountains here. If you go further north from here, black chert becomes common. Even farther in the southwest, there's some of the finest black chert you can find, according to Eric, that you can find in North America down further south, towards southwest Virginia.
Well, like I said, if you want to take time afterwards and come on up, we have some archaeology technicians here as well. We can also help you kind of follow your questions. But thank you for coming today. Please help.